On May 11th, 1979, Barbara Woolworth Hutton died at 66 with a heart attack, a Beverly Wilshire suite, and a final number attached to her name, $3,500. She had recently left Cedars-Sinai after pneumonia treatment, and fewer than a dozen people would follow her to Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. She was also the same age her grandfather had been at death, as if the family clock had struck twice at 66. At 21, the Woolworth heiress had controlled a fortune commonly put near $42 million, with millions more from her mother's estate. She had been rich enough to make princes wait, famous enough for New York newspapers to count the champagne at her debut, and vulnerable enough for 7 husbands to walk through the doors that money opened. 6 of those men took something. Cary Grant, of all the husbands, left her no poorer than he found her. Everyone knew the nickname, poor little rich girl. They knew the jewels, the palaces, the black dresses, the bitter divorces, the son who died in the Colorado mountains. And yet beneath all that noise was a child of 4 in New York, standing before a bedroom door on May 2nd, 1917, unable to wake her mother. This is the story of a woman who was handed a golden scepter before she understood what hands were for, and spent the rest of her life watching others reach for it. She could buy almost anything. What she kept losing was the one thing no fortune could guard. Barbara Woolworth Hutton was born in New York City on November 14, 1912, the only child of Franklin Laws Hutton and Edna Woolworth Hutton. Her father belonged to the Wall Street world of E.F. Hutton and Company. Her mother was the middle daughter of Frank Winfield Woolworth, the man who had turned nickel and dime shopping into one of the great retail systems of modern America. Frank Woolworth had begun far from marble. Born in upstate New York in 1852, awkward with customers and easily overlooked, he saw the future that older clerks had missed. A counter of cheap goods, prices fixed, shelves open, ordinary people allowed to touch what they might buy. From that modest idea, he built one of the great retail systems in America, and then raised a monument to it, the Woolworth Building on Broadway, a tower paid for in nickels and dimes. New York society still treated Frank Woolworth as a shopkeeper. That wound mattered. It drove him to push his daughters toward marriages that promised old names and polished invitations. Edna's marriage to Franklin Hutton had not been the match Woolworth wanted, but the first grandchild softened him. Barbara arrived into a family that had money, manners, and almost no peace. Franklin drank heavily and kept mistresses. Edna lived inside the humiliation of that marriage. In the Upper East Side household, nurses and governesses handled the child while the adults moved through betrayal and silence. Then came May 2nd, 1917. Barbara was 4 years old when her mother died at 33. The official cause was suffocation related to mastoiditis. Whispers of poison and despair followed the family for years. Barbara was the child who found her. After Edna's death, Franklin did not become a warmer father. Barbara spent time with relatives, including the household of Marjorie Merriweather Post, and then was sent to her grandparents' Long Island estate, Winfield Hall in Glen Cove. The place had more than 30,000 square feet and had cost $9 million. It had rooms made for banquets, not for a grieving child. Her grandmother Jenny was under medical care, rocking in a white wicker chair and unable to offer real companionship. Frank Woolworth, declining himself, was the one adult who showed Barbara sustained tenderness. He called her his princess and gave her material comfort. When he died in April 1919 from septicemia after an untreated dental infection, Barbara was 6. The first gentle hand was gone. She attended Miss Hewitt's classes in Manhattan and later Miss Porter's school in Farmington, Connecticut. She had almost no ordinary childhood friendships. Her closest companion was her cousin Jimmy Donahue, 3 years younger, another Woolworth heir, another child learning that a fortune could be a bright mark painted on the back. At school, Barbara tried a method that should make the heart wince. She gave other girls pearls, rubies, and dolls dressed in Lanvin clothing, hoping the gifts might purchase a seat beside them. It did not work, as childhood bargains never do. The gifts were taken. The giver remained apart. Before she had legal control of $1, she had already learned that people could accept a treasure without accepting the hand that offered it. In 1924, Jenny Woolworth died, and Barbara inherited roughly $26 million in trust, with a further $2 million in stock from Edna's separate inheritance. Franklin Hutton administered the money with skill. He would guard the investments better than he guarded the girl. Before Barbara was old enough to take the throne, the shape of her life was already visible. A fortune expanding, a child contracting, and every adult around her counting what she would one day possess. And then, at 18, New York was invited to watch. On November 14, 1930, Barbara Hutton turned 18, and her father gave her a debutante ball at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in New York. The nation was inside the Great Depression. Families were losing wages, farms, homes, and hope. Yet that evening, the Woolworth money stepped into society under chandeliers, flowers, music, and a price tag of $60,000. The details traveled faster than sympathy. 4 orchestras played. 200 waiters served 1,000 7-course midnight suppers and 1,000 breakfasts. 2,000 bottles of champagne were opened. Maurice Chevalier greeted guests dressed as Santa Claus. Rudy Vallee performed. The Astors and Rockefellers came. Each guest received a small jewelry case holding loose diamonds, emeralds, rubies, and sapphires. Barbara had not built the economy. She had not designed the party machinery. She was 18, a boarding school girl, and the central figure in an event adults had arranged for her. The Ritz-Carlton evening did something lasting to the child who had once eaten alone at Winfield Hall. It made her private hunger a public costume. From that birthday onward, every purchase, romance, illness, and gesture of generosity could be weighed against breadlines. She was not merely rich in 1930, she was useful to public anger. The public made no such distinction. Newspapers placed the cost of the ball beside the hunger of 1930, and the girl in the gown became a symbol large enough to hate. There was cruelty in the timing, and there was also cruelty in the simplicity of the public story. A young woman in a hotel ballroom became easier to condemn than the father who arranged the spectacle, the social code that required it, or the old money families who attended and then allowed the girl alone to carry the shame. Barbara's face appeared in print beside her diamonds. The room had contained 1,000 people. The blame narrowed to one. The phrase, "poor little rich girl," fastened itself to her life. It had existed before her, in a Mary Pickford film and a Noel Coward song, but Barbara made it flesh. Harry Warren's 1931 song, "I Found a $1 Million Baby in a 5 and 10 cent store," with lyrics by Billy Rose and Mort Dixon, fed the same appetite. Ogden Nash turned her into comic verse. A name became a performance, and the performance belonged to everyone except Barbara. By November 1933, when she turned 21, Franklin Hutton's management had grown her inheritance to roughly $42 million, with about $8 million more from Edna's estate. It was one of the largest private fortunes in the world. In modern comparison, the sum belonged somewhere among the hundreds of millions and beyond, depending on how one counts the past. However one counted it, Barbara had more money than many nations' ministers ever touched. The fortune that reached Barbara in 1933 had also survived a national wreck. Before the 1929 stock market crash, Franklin Hutton had liquidated volatile holdings while other members of the Woolworth family lost heavily. Whatever else he failed to give his daughter, he gave her a financial fortress, and the fortress made her more visible. She also wrote poems. At school and in private, she shaped lines on paper while the public shaped her into a headline. In 1934, under the name Barbara Medivani, she privately printed a slim book called The Enchanted in an edition of 200 copies. Years later, in 1957, a second volume, The Wayfarer, would follow. She distributed the work quietly among family and friends. The woman whom newspapers treated as an object still tried in private to make something of her own. After the debutante backlash, Franklin sent Barbara to Europe. It was meant to remove her from American fury. Instead, it placed her among men who understood that her loneliness had a bank balance. She moved through London, Paris, Venice, and other polished rooms, not yet hardened, still believing that someone might see the girl rather than the trust. The scepter was in her hands now. She had money, youth, a famous name, and no protection against flattery. She was 21. She was rich beyond reason. She still wanted to be chosen. And in Europe, a family calling itself royal was waiting. The Medivani family had arrived in the West with exile, charm, and flexible titles. Their father, General Cary Medivani, had served the Russian imperial world before revolution, and the Soviet takeover pushed the family out of Georgia. In Georgia, they had belonged to the Aznari, a lesser noble rank. In Paris and New York, the children became princes and princesses. The 5 Medivani siblings married well. Serge Medivani married the silent film star Paula Negri and left after the 1929 crash damaged her fortune. Alexis Medivani married Louise Astor Van Allen, a great-granddaughter of Mrs. William Astor and one of Barbara's own friends. Society noticed the pattern and gave them a useful, cutting name, the Marrying Medivanis. Alexis had already demonstrated the family method. His marriage to Louise Astor Van Allen connected him to one of New York's most recognizable old families, and his brother Serge's marriage to Paula Negri had tied the Medivani name to Hollywood glamour. Barbara did not meet a solitary suitor in Europe. She met a practiced household with a map of heiresses already marked. In the summer of 1932, at San Sebastian in Spain, Alexis's sister Russie helped arrange the trap. Barbara, Alexis, Louise, Russie, and others were together there when Barbara and Alexis were found in a compromising situation. The timing was not accidental. Witnesses appeared. Louise saw enough. Barbara fled to Paris in humiliation, and Russie followed with a threat, marriage, or a public scandal. Barbara was 20. She already knew how newspapers could bruise. The same press that had mocked the Ritz-Carlton ball could turn a private humiliation into a feast. She gave in. On June 22, 1933, Barbara married Alexis Medivani in a Russian Orthodox church in Paris. Franklin Hutton provided a dowry of $1 million. The marriage gave Barbara a title, which was precisely the sort of thing Frank Woolworth had once believed his daughters and granddaughters needed. It did not give her safety. The New York Daily News marked the wedding with a sneer at American money flowing from poor shoppers to a foreign title. Even at the altar, Barbara was not allowed the dignity of being merely a bride. She was a public account book in white. On their wedding night, Alexis told his new wife she was too heavy. Barbara was 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed 148 pounds. The next morning, she began living on black coffee and violent self-denial. Within months, she lost 40 pounds. That sentence from a husband's mouth became one of the cruel little hinges on which a life can turn. We have all known someone, fellow travelers, who believes love must be earned by becoming smaller. Barbara had learned that lesson too early, and now a husband with a borrowed crown sharpened it into ritual. Alexis spent from her fortune as though it were his own inheritance. He bought polo ponies, clothing, jewellery, and the life of a man who preferred the appearance of rank to the discipline of earning. Barbara paid. She had been trained by neglect to mistake giving for being loved. Money left her hands, hope remained dim and stubborn. They divorced in March 1935. The marriage had lasted less than 2 years and cost more than $2 million, including the dowry and his spending. The money mattered, but the deeper cost was precedent. A man had found the gate, entered by romance, and walked away richer. 5 months later, on August 1st, 1935, Alexis Mandevani died near Albons in Catalonia, Spain, after his Rolls-Royce struck a tree and overturned. Baroness Maud von Thyssen was in the car and survived with severe injuries. Alexis was 27. Barbara was already stepping into her second marriage. Within days of the Mandevani divorce, she had agreed to marry Count Kurt von Haugwitz Reventlow, a Danish nobleman with an old name, a thin purse, and a temperament far more dangerous than Alexis's charm. The first crack had opened. The second would not be so neat. Barbara married Count Kurt von Haugwitz Reventlow in 1935. She was 22, divorced once, and still young enough to believe speed could be proof of feeling. Before the ceremony, she gave him $1.5 million. It was spoken of as a gift. It looked, from a colder distance, like a price. For the wedding, Barbara wore black silk with a fascinator and a fur coat. The colour was noticed even then. A bride in black is not a prophecy, of course. Still, history has its dreadful taste for images that later seem to have been waiting. Reventlow was tall, Danish, controlling, and violent. Mandevani had treated her fortune as opportunity. Reventlow treated Barbara herself as something to command. He bullied her, frightened her, and at least once hurt her badly enough to send her to hospital. In London, he was arrested after threatening her with bodily harm. The marriage did not hide its danger very well. It merely dressed it. On February 24, 1936, their son Lance Reventlow was born in London. The press called him the richest baby in the world. Barbara nearly died giving birth. For a brief moment, motherhood offered a new story. A husband, a child, a house to build, a family that might repair the family she had lost in 1917. That house was Winfield House in Regent's Park. The site Barbara chose had its own freight of memory. Before her, it had been St Dunstan's, a home for soldiers blinded in the First World War, and by the 1930s it was decaying, half claimed by fire. Barbara did not merely buy land in London. She bought a place already crowded with vanished lives. There she built a great neo-Georgian house, finished in 1938, and named for Frank Winfield Woolworth, its 12 acres of garden second in central London only to Buckingham Palaces. And yet the centre of the story was not a house, it was an oath. In December 1937, Barbara walked into a federal courthouse in New York and renounced her American citizenship. Reventlow had pushed the decision. The public reason was tax. The more private arithmetic concerned inheritance. If Barbara died as an American, a large portion of the estate could be taken before it reached Reventlow and Lance. As a Danish citizen, she made that transfer easier. The reaction was brutal. Walter Winchell attacked her on the radio. The New York Times used the word despicable. Within 2 days of her departure for Europe, 3 Woolworth stores in New York closed and 36 more were threatened. Employees wired Barbara at sea, urging her to press management for a living wage. She did not answer them. She hired public relations help instead. The debut ball had made her resented. Alexis Midivani had made her ridiculous. The renunciation made her, to many Americans, a traitor. The nickels and dimes that built the Woolworth fortune had come from American counters. Now the heiress had signed away the country that made those counters possible. That was the moment the scepter slipped. Not in a palace and not at a ball, but in a courthouse, with a signature that turned private fear into national anger. By 1938, Barbara and Reventlow had separated. He demanded $5 million and full custody of Lance. The legal battle moved through Danish and American courts, and the final divorce decree came in 1941. Reventlow gained temporary custody. Barbara regained her son in 1945. The boy had already spent too much of childhood being moved by lawyers. By then, Barbara was using sedatives and eating almost nothing. The black coffee punishment that began with Midivani had hardened into a bodily prison. She had a son. She had a London house. She had a name that filled columns on 2 continents. What she did not have was rest. Everything after the oath carried its shadow. War came before Barbara could make Winfield House a home. By 1939, with Europe closing into violence and the Reventlow marriage broken, she took Lance and moved to California. The Royal Air Force requisitioned the Regent's Park house for a barrage balloon unit. Officers used the rooms as a club, played football on the Great Lawn, and named their team Barbara's Own. When the war ended, Barbara returned to damaged rooms, buckled floorboards, shattered windows, and wires hanging loose from ceilings. In 1946, she told her New York lawyer to give Winfield House to the United States government. The price was $1. President Harry Truman accepted, and after renovation the house became, in 1955, the official residence of the American ambassador to the court of St. James's. Of all her houses, that one survived best because she let it go. During the war years, she tried to soften the wound left by the citizenship oath. She supported British use of Winfield House, gave her yacht to the Royal Navy, helped free French causes, and appeared in war bond publicity. It helped a little. America could forgive generosity. It did not forget abandonment. Then came Cary Grant. They met in Los Angeles in the summer of 1941 through Dorothy DeFrasso, an American countess who moved between Hollywood and Europe. Grant, born Archibald Alexander Leach in Bristol on January 18, 1904, had made himself into one of Hollywood's highest-paid actors after vaudeville, New York, and a changed name. He tracked every dollar. He needed nothing from Barbara. That, to her, was almost unbelievable. They married on July 8, 1942, near Lake Arrowhead in the San Bernardino Mountains, at the home of Grant's agent, Frank Vincent. The press called them Cash and Cary. For once, the joke was wrong. Grant was affectionate with Lance and treated the boy warmly. Yet Barbara and discipline were strangers. Grant rose early, worked hard, ate simply, and valued order. Barbara slept late, ate little, gave money away impulsively, and drifted between pills, parties, and private fear. They separated in 1944, and the divorce was finalized on August 30, 1945. She offered him a settlement. He refused. After Grant, the fallen crown grew colder. Prince Igor Trubetskoy, a Lithuanian-born painter and later racing driver, married her in Switzerland in 1947. He won the Targa Florio in Sicily in 1954 after the marriage had already collapsed. They separated in 1951, and the end was followed by headlines about Barbara trying to harm herself. Porfirio Rubirosa came next, the Dominican diplomat and playboy who had already married Danielle Darieux and Doris Duke. On December 30th, 1953, Barbara married him. She wore black and weighed barely 90 pounds. He received gifts that included a coffee plantation, polo ponies, a converted bomber aircraft, and cash running into the millions. The marriage lasted 53 days. In November 1955, she married Baron Gottfried von Kram, the German tennis champion who had reached Wimbledon finals in the 1930s and suffered under Nazi law. He was kind, and the marriage lasted longer than most. By 1959, it was over. Kindness had not been enough. It so rarely is when the old wound keeps speaking from beneath the skin. That same year, Barbara built a Japanese-style estate in Cuernavaca, Mexico, on about 30 acres, importing materials and craftsmen from Japan. In Tangier, where she had arrived in the late 1940s, she bought houses in the Kasbah and combined them into Sidi Hosni, a roughly 60-room palace above the harbour. She hosted dinners for 40 guests by candlelight, and she also funded local charities, a medical clinic, food distributions, a soup kitchen for impoverished Riffians and poor children at the American school. It is the part of these stories we want least to hear. Sometimes generosity and desperation wear the same gloves. Barbara gave because people needed help. She also gave because being needed could feel for a moment like being loved. Her jewels became another language. Cecil Beaton photographed her at Sidi Hosni in the Vladimir Tiara, a piece once worn by Romanov Grand Duchesses. In 1965, she bought a 48-carat pear-shaped diamond. She wore imperial stones at small dinners and gave jewelry away almost as easily as money. She was a favoured client of Cristobal Balenciaga and could buy whole collections when other women were limited to a few pieces. Houses required staffs whether she lived in them or not. Advisors made questionable investments and took fees. Friends, husbands, servants, strangers, and causes all drew from the same weakening river. In 1964, Barbara married for the 7th and last time. Raymond Doan, later styled Prince Raymond Doan Vinna Champasak, was an artist. It was said that Barbara helped purchase the title attached to him. By 1966, the marriage had effectively ended. He kept the settlement and the title. She kept the silence after another attempt. 7 marriages, 7 divorces, 1 son grown up inside the machinery of custody, 1 fortune moving outward through gifts, settlements, palaces, clothes, jewels, nurses, lawyers, and men who came close to the fire long enough to warm their hands. The throne was not empty yet, but it had become very cold. Lance Reventlow grew into a man who preferred engines to drawing rooms. His childhood had been divided by court orders, borders, and parental wounds. By 1945, when Barbara regained him, he was 9 and had already learned too much about adult conflict. In his mid-20s, he founded Reventlow Automobiles Incorporated and built the Scarab. Lance's machines gave him a grammar Barbara could not speak. The Scarab was a front-engine car powered by a Chevrolet Phi 8, and in 1958 it won several domestic races before the sport's designs moved on. In international competition the following year, the car was already behind the times, and Lance closed the operation before he turned 30. It was a brief, serious attempt to make something with his own name rather than merely spend the one he had inherited. Lance married the actress Jill St. John in 1959, and they divorced in 1963. A year later, he married Cheryl Holdridge, a former Mouseketeer. Friends saw steadiness in that second marriage, the kind of steadiness that had rarely been granted to him as a child. On July 24, 1972, Lance boarded a small plane in Aspen, Colorado. It crashed into the mountains shortly after takeoff. He was 36. Severe weather and possible mechanical failure were later tied to the crash. Cheryl survived him. Barbara was in Tangier when the news reached her. It was said she did not speak for several days. She had fought for Lance in court, lost him, regained him, loved him, failed him, and watched him grow beyond the reach of her money. Now he was gone. The one person who should have outlived her had entered the ground before her. She did not attend the funeral. Illness, grief, and inability all gathered around that absence. After Lance's death, her health worsened quickly. The dependence on sedatives deepened. The weight loss accelerated. Visitors in the mid-1970s saw a woman who appeared far older than her years. In the closing stretch of her life, Barbara lived in hotels. The Pierre in New York, the Ritz in London, Claridge's, where by 1968 her seclusion and decline had become more visible. Then the Beverly Wilshire in Beverly Hills, where staff answered when she called and meals arrived without conversation. On Wilshire Boulevard, it became not another purchase, but the final address on a long list of borrowed rooms at last. She tried in the early 1970s to regain the American citizenship she had renounced under Reventlow's pressure 35 years before. The reversal came quietly, without the fury that had met the original oath. It could not restore what had been lost. By the last years, the visitors thinned. Dinah Merrill, linked to Barbara through the family world of Marjorie Merriweather Post, was among those who still came. Oleg Cassini saw her near the end and found her shockingly thin. She spent long hours in bed, with books, Coca-Cola, cigarettes, nurses, and attendants. The parties had stopped. The palaces were elsewhere. The money was almost gone. What remained of the fortune was negligible beside the Woolworth name. The number attached to the ending was $3,500, though those close to her would dispute the exact accounting. The shape of the ending was harder to dispute. The river had nearly run dry. She had recently been discharged from Cedars-Sinai after treatment for pneumonia when, on May 11, 1979, she suffered a heart attack in her Beverly Wilshire penthouse. She was pronounced dead at Cedars-Sinai. She was 66, the same age Frank Woolworth had been when he died in 1919. Her funeral took place at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. The service was small enough for every mourner to be counted, an ending far from the 1,000 suppers at the Ritz-Carlton. Fewer than a dozen people attended. Cliff Robertson read one of her poems. The distance between those two rooms was almost the whole story. Barbara was buried in the Woolworth family mausoleum, near the mother whose death had split her childhood in two. The scepter was not in anyone's hand now. It lay broken among receipts, headlines, and old keys to rooms she no longer entered. Barbara Hutton's life is often reduced to arithmetic. 42 million at 21, 7 husbands, 53 days with Rubirosa, $1 for Winfield House, $3,500 at the end. Numbers are useful. They keep the story from floating away. Yet numbers alone cannot explain a woman who gave jewels to near strangers, printed poems in private, and built houses on 3 continents while looking, always, for a room that felt like shelter. At the graveside, Cliff Robertson, reading her poem, gave the name Barbara Hutton one brief moment that was not a bill, a marriage license, a medical chart, or a headline. It was small. For her, small recognitions had always been rare. The world remembered the spectacle because spectacle was easy. The Ritz-Carlton Ball in 1930, Maurice Chevalier as Santa Claus, 2,000 bottles of champagne, the Cash and Carry headline in 1942, the black dress in 1953, the hotel suite in 1979. Every age chooses the facts that flatter its appetite, and Barbara's age liked to eat women whole. And yet there was another Barbara, harder to hold. The 4-year-old in New York, the schoolgirl at Miss Porter's giving gifts in hope of friendship, the young woman in Paris printing The Enchanted in 200 copies, the mother in court fighting for Lance, the hostess in Tangier feeding poor families and paying for children at the American school, the sick woman trying to become American again after the oath that had ruined her public standing. We watch these lives, fellow travelers, not because we enjoy the fall, but because something in us recognizes the distance between what a person owns and what a person can keep. Barbara owned houses, titles, emeralds, rubies, pearls, gowns, and names that opened doors. She could not keep her mother. She could not keep love from becoming a bargain. She could not keep her son from the Aspen Mountains. In the old stories, the rich woman with the bright crown receives a lesson. This is not that. Barbara Hutton was not a lesson. She was a child made visible by money, a woman pursued by need, and an old sorrow walking through expensive rooms. The family pattern around her had never been simple. Frank Woolworth left 3 daughters, and the money moved outward without the severe protections he had applied to his shops. Helena married Charles Edward Francis McCann. Edna died at 33. Jessie's son, Jimmy Donahue, Barbara's closest childhood companion, burned through his own share, drank heavily, lived flamboyantly, and died in 1966 at 51. The Woolworth fortune had been built by discipline and inherited by children taught almost nothing of it. Even the company bent under time. The 5 and dime name that built the fortune faded from the streets, the last stores eventually closing. Empires survive sometimes only by ceasing to resemble themselves. At Woodlawn, the Woolworth name returned to stone. The stores were gone from their first glory. The building still stood at 233 Broadway. Winfield House still carried her grandfather's name in Regent's Park. The jewels moved on to other throats and other vaults, and the golden scepter, once held too early by a lonely child, lay where it had fallen, beside an empty throne. If you found yourself in this story, even for a moment, you may find yourself in the next one too. Subscribe to The Fallen Scepter and stay with us. There are many more lives to remember.